New York City. The St. Regis. 8:00 p.m. The ballroom smells of lilies and expensive lies. My name is Laura McKenzie, and to the 500 guests sipping champagne, I am just the ghost in the corner, the crippled sister my parents try to hide. They are celebrating my brother's rise to power, unaware that he built his throne on a foundation of fraud. They think I am here to beg for scraps. I am actually here to take back my company. The spotlight is searching for the groom, but when I step forward, it will reveal the truth. Tonight, the applause dies. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Laura McKenzie. The ballroom of the St. Regis smelled of lilies, imported champagne, and the specific metallic scent of old money being spent to prove a point. From where I stood, tucked against a marble pillar near the service entrance, the scene looked less like a wedding and more like a coronation. 500 guests, a 10-piece orchestra playing a sanitized version of a pop song, and centerpieces that likely cost more than my first car. My parents, Marlene and Richard McKenzie, were holding court near the head table, their smiles tight, practiced, and predatory. They weren't just the hosts, they were the architects of this entire illusion. They had spent $100,000 tonight to celebrate the son they chose. And the part they didn't talk about, the part that sat like a stone in my gut, was that they had paid for it with the parts of me they took. I adjusted the hem of my dress. It was a simple navy sheath off the rack chosen specifically to blend into the upholstery. In this family, visibility was a trap. If you were seen, you could be targeted. If you were invisible, you survived. I watched my brother Ethan moving through the crowd like a shark through warm water. He was the man of the hour, the groom, the rising star executive, the golden boy who could do no wrong. He threw his head back and laughed at something a board member said, the sound booming and confident. He looked the part perfectly, the tailored tuxedo, the Patek Philippe watch our father had gifted him, the way he clapped men on the back and kissed the hands of the investors' wives. It was a performance flawless and hollow. I needed water. My throat felt like it was coated in dust. I pushed off the pillar and navigated the edge of the crowd toward the bar, keeping my head down. I almost made it. I was 3 feet from the polished mahogany counter when a heavy hand clamped onto my shoulder. "Laura," a voice boomed. It wasn't a greeting, it was an announcement. I froze, then turned. Ethan stood there, flushed with expensive scotch and adrenaline, holding a tumbler of ice water in one hand and a half-empty glass of amber liquid in the other. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by 2 of his groomsmen, junior VPs, who mirrored his posture like funhouse reflections. "Ethan," I said, keeping my voice flat. "Congratulations." "Look at this," he said, turning to his friends, gesturing at me with the glass of water. "The ghost returns. Mom said you might not show, said it would be too much pressure for you." He lingered on the word pressure with a sneer that suggested fragility, weakness. "I'm just getting a drink, Ethan. I'll go back to my corner." "Oh, come on, Laurie, don't be like that." He stepped closer, invading my personal space. The alcohol on his breath was sharp. "You look, well, simple. Very you." He leaned in, feigning a whisper that was loud enough for the circle of onlookers to hear. "Try not to ask anyone for a loan tonight, okay? It's tacky." His friends snickered. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, not from shame, but from the sheer suffocating predictability of it. "I don't need your money, Ethan." "Right, you're finding yourself. We know." He laughed again, a harsh bark. Then he pivoted to leave, but as he turned, his arms swung out wide, clumsy, and deliberate. The contents of the water glass hit me square in the chest. Ideally, it would have been just water, but the ice cubes struck my sternum with surprising force. The cold shock gasped the air out of my lungs. The water soaked instantly into the cheap fabric of my dress, turning the navy black, plastering the material to my skin in a dark, humiliating blotch that ran down to my waist. The immediate radius of the party went silent. Then Ethan covered his mouth, his eyes dancing with malicious delight. "Oh God, Laura, I am so sorry I didn't see you there. You're just so quiet." He grabbed a cocktail napkin and made a half-hearted dabbing motion at my shoulder, which only smeared the water further. Clumsy me, here, clean yourself up. The laughter started as a ripple, nervous, uncertain. People looked at Ethan, saw him grinning, and realized the social math required them to find this funny. If the VP laughs, you laugh. So they did. A chorus of forced chuckles surrounded me. I stood there dripping, feeling the ice melt against my skin. Then came the second wave. My parents. Marlene McKenzie materialized from the crowd, her face a mask of pained tolerance. She didn't look at my wet dress. She looked at the guests watching me. Laura, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. Please, not tonight. He threw water on me, I said, my voice steady, though my hands were trembling. It was an accident, Richard chimed in, stepping up beside my mother, placing a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder. Look at him, Laura. It's his wedding day. He's excited. Don't be dramatic. I'm not being… Stop, my mother cut in. Just go to the bathroom and dry off. Or leave. God, Laura, look at your brother. He's a vice president before 35. He's built a legacy. Can you just let him have this moment without making it about your… situation? My situation, I asked. Some people have drive, my father muttered, adjusting his cufflinks, dismissing me entirely. And some people just don't. Go fix yourself up. They turned their backs on me. The wall of suits and silk closed up, sealing them in their circle of success and leaving me on the outside. Again. I walked to the restrooms, my wet shoes squeaking softly on the marble. I didn't cry. I had burned out my tear ducts years ago. Instead, I went into the handicap stall, the only one with enough space to breathe, and locked the door. I grabbed a stack of rough paper towels and began to blot the dress. The cold dampness against my skin triggered the memory, as it always did. The situation my parents loved to reference. 6 years ago, I hadn't been a ghost. I had been 22, fresh out of college, and working a grueling logistics job on the shipping docks to pay off my student loans because my parents had cut me off to teach me character. I was on the floor when a forklift driver, overworked and undertrained, backed into a pallet of steel rebar. The stack collapsed. It crushed my right leg and pinned me for 40 minutes before they could dig me out. The surgeries took a year. The limp took 2 to hide. But the settlement, that was supposed to be my freedom. The company settled for a significant sum, enough to pay my medical bills, clear my debt, and start over. I was on heavy painkillers, drifting in and out of consciousness in the hospital bed when my parents brought the papers. We're handling it for you, honey, my mother had said, stroking my hair, her eyes scanning the legal documents. You're not in a state to manage this kind of money. We'll put it in a family trust for your recovery. I signed. I trusted them. I was their daughter. 6 months later, when the medical bills came due and I asked for access to the funds, the money was gone. Family emergencies, my father had said vaguely. Market volatility. Investments in our future. The reality was simpler. They used my pain to buy Ethan's way into the executive track. My shattered leg paid for his MBA. My rehabilitation money paid for the down payment on his penthouse. They stripped me for parts to build him, and when I asked for it back, they gaslighted me until I wondered if I was insane. We fed you, they'd say. We housed you. You owe us. So I left. I disappeared into a studio apartment on the bad side of town. I stopped coming to holidays. I let them think I was broken, poor, and bitter. I let them believe I was the failure they needed me to be, so Ethan could shine brighter by comparison. But I wasn't idle. I looked at myself in the mirror above the sink. The water stain was fading, but the outline remained. I wasn't here tonight for reconciliation. I wasn't here to beg for scraps or an apology that would never come. I was here because I knew something they didn't. Ethan wasn't just a bully, he was a thief. And not just of my money, he was stealing from the company. My company. That was the secret that kept my spine straight when my father mocked my lack of drive. They assumed the company Aurora Global Logistics was some faceless conglomerate where Ethan had dazzled his way to the top. They assumed his rapid promotions were due to his charm and the McKenzie pedigree. They were wrong. I am not a CEO who wears a hoodie and gives TED Talks. I don't have my face on the website. When I was recovering bedbound and angry, I met Marcus, a retired logistics tycoon, who saw something in my analysis of supply chain inefficiencies, the very things I'd noticed working on the docks before the accident. He put up the capital. I put up the brainpower. We built Aurora Global Logistics from a laptop in my hospital room, but I knew my name was a liability. If my parents knew I had money, they would swarm. If Ethan knew I was involved, he would try to take credit. So we structured it carefully. I am the majority shareholder through a blind holding company, Obsidian Trust. My name appears on nothing public. I sit on no boards that publish minutes. I operate through proxies and legal counsel. Ethan was hired 5 years ago because his resume looked good. He climbed the ladder because I let him. I wanted to see if he had changed. If given a chance to work, he would develop the integrity my parents claimed he had. Instead, he had used his position to rot the company from the inside out. I finished drying my dress. It looked terrible, stiff and wrinkled, but I didn't care. I unlocked the bathroom door and walked back out into the roar of the reception. I found a spot in the shadows again. The speeches were starting. Ethan stood at the microphone, the spotlight gleaming off his teeth. He raised a glass of champagne, the bubbles catching the light. "To family," he said, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "And to success. We build it with our own hands, brick by brick. No handouts. Just grit." The crowd applauded. My father wiped a tear from his eye. My mother looked around to make sure everyone saw her wiping a tear from her eye. I watched them, feeling a cold, calm clarity settle over me. Tonight they were celebrating a lie. A lie built on my broken bones and sustained by their delusion. They thought they were untouchable because they controlled the narrative. They thought money was the only power that mattered. I checked my phone. A single text message had arrived from Maya, my best friend, and the only person outside of legal counsel who knew the whole truth. "Holt is in the building." He brought the file. Darius Holt, the compliance officer Ethan had buried. The man who had tried to warn the board about the safety violations, the kickbacks, the falsified safety logs that were one bad day away from killing someone's crew. Ethan had destroyed Holt's career to cover his own tracks, but Holt had kept the receipts. I looked up from the phone to Ethan's smiling face. He looked so safe. He looked so sure that the world was his to break. "Okay," I whispered to the empty air. "Then we do it." I slipped the phone into my pocket. I wasn't going to make a scene. I wasn't going to throw a drink. I was going to do what I had done for the last 6 years. I was going to work. And by the time the cake was cut, Ethan wouldn't just be fired. He would be erased. I moved through the wedding reception like a phantom. It was a skill I had perfected over the last half-decade, how to be present without being perceived, how to occupy the negative space in a room. While the guests were distracted by the arrival of the prime rib and the free-flowing Chardonnay, I began my circuit. I wasn't just a bitter sister lurking in the corners. I was an auditor conducting a field inspection. My first stop was the periphery of the high-top tables near the open bar where the real business was being conducted. Ethan was holding court with Arthur Sterling, one of the company's oldest board members. Sterling was a man of the old guard, obsessed with quarterly growth and willfully blind to how it was achieved. I drifted behind a large floral arrangement of white hydrangeas, close enough to hear the clink of ice in their glasses. "The Q3 projections look aggressive, Ethan," Sterling was saying, his voice low but concerned. "Especially with the maintenance overhaul in the distribution centers. That capital expenditure is going to hit the bottom line hard." Ethan laughed, a dismissive sound that grated against my nerves. "Arthur, you worry too much. That's why you have me. We're not booking the maintenance costs in Q3. I've moved them to a deferred capex schedule for next fiscal year. It massages the numbers just enough to trigger the executive bonus pool, and by the time the bill comes due, we'll have the revenue from the new contracts to cover it." "Is that..." Strictly compliant? Sterling asked, hesitating. It's creative, Ethan corrected, clapping the older man on the shoulder. And it's what keeps the stock price up. Don't ask how the sausage is made, Arthur. Just enjoy the meal. I felt a cold spike of anger. He wasn't just incompetent. He was cooking the books to secure his own bonus, pushing necessary safety maintenance down the road to line his pockets today. I made a mental note. Fraudulent accounting practices, admission of intent. I moved on. Near the DJ booth, I spotted a face that didn't belong. It was a man in an ill-fitting suit looking uncomfortable among the tuxedoed elite. I recognized him immediately from the internal vendor lists I reviewed monthly. It was Greg Salter, the owner of a mid-tier IT security firm that had recently won a massive contract to overhaul Aurora's cybersecurity. It was a contract that had been bid at 30% above market rate. I watched as Ethan broke away from Sterling and approached Salter. They didn't shake hands, they did a quick furtive nod. Ethan slipped an envelope into Salter's jacket pocket, ostensibly a tip or a thank you. But the body language screamed kickback. Salter wasn't a guest, he was an accomplice. My phone buzzed against my thigh. It was time. I slipped out through the service doors into the utilitarian hallway that ran behind the ballroom. The air here was cooler, smelling of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Leaning against a stack of folded chairs was Darius Holt. Darius looked like a man who hadn't slept in a month. He was Aurora's chief compliance officer, a role that was supposed to be the moral compass of the corporation. Under Ethan's regime, he had been reduced to a rubber stamp. He held a thick manila folder against his chest like a shield. "Ms. McKenzie," he whispered when he saw me. He didn't know I was the owner. He only knew me as Maya's contact, a consultant brought in to help him expose the rot. "I shouldn't be here. If Ethan sees me..." "He won't," I said, my voice soft but firm. "Did you bring it?" He handed over the folder, his hands shaking. "It's worse than I thought. It's not just the accounting, and it's not just the IT kickbacks." He took a ragged breath. He signed off on the electrical certifications for the new Midwest warehouse. He bypassed the inspection entirely to save 3 weeks on the launch timeline. The wiring isn't rated for the load. If they run the sorters at full capacity, it's going to spark. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My own leg throbbed a phantom ache from the metal pins holding my bones together. I knew what happened when executives cut corners on safety. I knew the sound of crushing metal and the feeling of being trapped under the weight of someone else's greed. "He's risking lives," I said, the realization settling in like concrete. "This isn't just financial fraud, it's criminal negligence." "I tried to write the report," Darius said, his voice cracking. "I sent a draft to his office. He told me if I filed it, he'd bury me. He said he'd make sure I never worked in this industry again. He called me unstable. He threatened my pension." "He can't bury you, Darius," I said, taking the file. It was heavy. It felt like a weapon. "Because he doesn't own the shovel. You did the right thing. Go to your car. Wait for my text." Darius nodded, looking at me with a mixture of fear and desperate hope, then turned and bolted down the hallway toward the exit. I stood alone in the fluorescent light, opening the file. It was all there. Emails from Ethan explicitly ordering the falsification of safety logs, invoices from Salter's company with inflated hours, a draft of the whistleblower report Darius had been terrified to send. My internal conflict, the small part of me that wondered if ruining my brother's wedding was too cruel, evaporated. This wasn't revenge anymore. Revenge is petty. It's about feelings. This was a rescue mission. Ethan was a cancer, and if I didn't cut him out tonight, innocent people were going to bleed. I closed the file and composed myself. I needed to get this to Maya, who was stationed in the production booth with the AV team ready to digitize the evidence for the board. But as I stepped back into the corridor leading to the ballroom, my path was blocked. "There you are." My mother's voice clipped the air. Marlene and Richard stood there walling me in. They had clearly been hunting for me. My mother reached out and adjusted the strap of my dress, her touch possessing the warmth of a lizard. "We were worried," she lied. People are asking where you went. It looks strange, Laura. You wandering off? I was in the restroom, I said. Listen, my father said, stepping closer, looming over me. We've been talking. We don't want you to feel excluded. I spoke to one of Ethan's friends, a developer. He needs a receptionist. It's entry level, but maybe if you apply yourself, you can get off, whatever this path is you're on. The condescension was breathtaking. They were offering me a receptionist job at a company I could likely buy and sell. I have a job, Dad, I said quietly. Doing what? He scoffed. Freelancing. That's not a career, Laura. That's a hobby. Look at your brother. Look at this room. This is what success looks like. We just want you to be safe. We want to stop worrying about you. We can introduce you to people, my mother added, her eyes darting around to ensure no one important was witnessing this interaction. Just, please don't embarrass us tonight. Stay at your table. Don't drink too much. And for God's sake, smile. Before I could answer, the doors swung open and Ethan appeared. He had clearly been looking for his parents, likely to brag about another conquest, but his face lit up with a sneer when he saw me cornered. Family meeting, he asked, sliding his arm around our mother's shoulders. Is she asking for money again? Ethan, be nice, Mom said, though she smiled. I'm just saying. Ethan chuckled, looking me up and down. I know it's tough, Lori, watching everyone else succeed. I was telling Mom earlier I'd be happy to pay for your therapy. Seriously, I think you have some unresolved trauma from the accident that's holding you back. You're just so angry all the time. It's unhealthy. The air in the hallway grew thick. He was rewriting my history in real time, painting me as the broken, jealous sister who needed his charity. He was using my physical trauma, the trauma he profited from, as a prop to showcase his own magnanimity. I felt the urge to scream. I wanted to list his crimes right there. I wanted to tell him that while he was playing VP, I was approving his budget caps. I wanted to shatter his ego into 1,000 pieces. But I remembered the rule: no emotional outbursts, only receipts. If I screamed now, I was just the crazy sister. I needed them to commit. I needed him to stand on that stage and claim to be a man of honor so that when the truth hit, the contrast would be blinding. I forced a small, tight smile. Thank you for the offer, Ethan. I'll keep it in mind. Ethan blinked, surprised by my capitulation. He looked disappointed that I hadn't taken the bait. Right, well, good. We should get back, Dad said, checking his watch. The speeches are starting. They swept back into the ballroom, a phalanx of entitlement, leaving me in the hallway. I pulled out my phone. I have the physical file. Holt is safe. Handing off to you now. Maya copy. I'm ready. The board members are all seated near the front. The external counsel is on standby for the conference call. We have the leverage. I walked to the side door of the AV booth and slipped the folder to Maya. She was my proxy, my voice of strategy. She took the folder without a word, her face grim. She knew what was in there. She knew we were about to drop a nuclear bomb on a wedding cake. I checked my mental inventory. Evidence: documented proof of falsified compliance certifications with Ethan's digital signature. Check. Witnesses: Darius Holt, whistleblower, report filed. Greg Salter, conflict of interest, trail established. Check. Authority: the Obsidian Trust corporate documents in my cloud drive, proving I held 51% of the voting shares. The board resolution I had signed this morning, authorizing an immediate independent investigation and the suspension of executive officers pending review. Check. I wasn't just a guest anymore. I was the executioner. I walked back into the ballroom. The lights had dimmed. A spotlight swept across the room, searching for its star. I found a spot near the back, leaning against the wall, my dress still damp and cold against my skin. It felt like armor now. The master of ceremonies, a man with a radio voice and a shiny suit, stepped up to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, he boomed, we have a special, unexpected family moment tonight. The groom, a man of vision, a man who has led Aurora Global Logistics to new heights, would like to say a few words about integrity and legacy. Please welcome Mr. Ethan McKenzie. The room erupted in applause. My parents stood up, clapping frantically, their faces beaming with pride. Ethan jogged up to the stage, feigning modesty, waving to the crowd. He adjusted the mic, flashed that winning smile, and looked out over the sea of people he had fooled. I watched him from the darkness. He looked invincible. He looked like a king. Perfect. I thought, the adrenaline turning ice cold in my veins. Say it loud. The spotlight held Ethan in a halo of white brilliance. He looked the part of the corporate savior, perfectly leaning casually against the podium, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing with the practiced ease of a man who believed his own mythology. The room was silent, hanging on his every word. My parents were seated at the head table, their faces tilted upward in rapt adoration, drinking in the applause as if it were nourishment. You know, Ethan said, his voice dropping to that confidential, earnest register he used to close deals. People talk about success like it's magic, like it's luck. But we know the truth, don't we? He nodded to the table of investors on the left. It's grit. It's the willingness to make the hard calls. It's about integrity, doing the right thing when no one is watching. I felt a physical revulsion, a nausea that tightened my throat. The audacity was suffocating. This was a man who had authorized a safety bypass on a high-voltage system to save 3 weeks on a timeline, a man who was risking the lives of warehouse packers, making $15 an hour so he could hit a bonus target. And here he was preaching about integrity. I have to thank my parents. Ethan continued, raising his glass to them. Marlene and Richard beamed, clutching each other's hands. For teaching me that the McKenzie name means something, for believing in me when others didn't. He paused for effect, his gaze flickering briefly, dismissively toward the dark corner where he knew I was standing. The implication was clear. I was the others. I was the cautionary tale. The failure who had let a little thing like a crushed leg stop me from conquering the world. Some people let their circumstances break them, Ethan said, his voice taking on a pitying edge. They let tragedy become an excuse for mediocrity. But in this family, we don't make excuses, we make history. The crowd murmured their agreement, a soft wave of validation. That was the cue. He had laid the trap for himself. All I had to do was spring it. I stepped away from the wall. I didn't run. I didn't storm the stage. I walked down the center aisle, the gap between the round tables, with a steady, rhythmic gait. My limp was there, as it always was, a hitch in my step that I usually tried to hide. Tonight, I let it be visible. I let the sound of my heel striking the floor cut through the silence. Heads began to turn. A few people whispered. My mother's smile faltered, then vanished as she saw me approaching the light. She made a sharp hand gesture, a sit-down motion, but I ignored her. I stopped 10 feet from the stage. I was directly in the spotlight's spill now. Ethan looked down at me, annoyed, his mouth twitching. Laura, he said into the microphone, his voice amplified and booming. We're in the middle of a toast. Maybe we can do this later. I have a question, Ethan, I said. I didn't have a microphone, but the acoustics of the ballroom were excellent, and the room had gone deadly quiet. My voice carried clear and cold. Laura, sit down, my father hissed from the head table, half rising from his chair. It's a simple question, I continued, locking eyes with my brother. Regarding the Hawthorne warehouse expansion. Ethan laughed, a nervous, incredulous sound. He looked at the crowd, inviting them to share in the absurdity. My sister, everyone. Always thinking about work. Laura, this is a wedding, not a board meeting. Did you approve the electrical certification for the Hawthorne facility? I asked, raising my voice just enough to override his chuckle. And did you certify to the board that it complied with all safety protocols? The room stiffened. The investors at Table 4 stopped drinking. They knew what the Hawthorne project was. It was the company's biggest capital risk. Ethan's smile hardened. He gripped the podium. He had two choices: tell the truth and admit negligence, or lie and commit fraud in front of witnesses. He chose the path he always chose. Yes, Ethan said, his voice tight. Of course I did. It's fully compliant. Now if you're quite done trying to ruin— You're lying, I said. A gasp rippled through the room. Excuse me. Ethan snapped, his face reddening. I raised my hand. It was the signal. High above the stage, the massive projection screens that had been cycling through photos of Ethan and his bride suddenly went black. A split second later, they flared to life with a stark, high-resolution document. It wasn't a wedding photo. It was a PDF of the Hawthorne electrical inspection waiver. That is your signature, Ethan, I said, pointing to the screen. Dated 3 weeks ago, waiving the load-bearing stress test to accelerate the opening date. And right next to it is the internal email you sent to the contractor stating, and I quote, "Just get it done. I don't care about the regs, I care about the Q3 launch." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum sucking the air out of the room. "What is this?" Ethan demanded, stepping back from the podium as if it were hot. "Cut the feed. Turn that off." But Maya was in control now. The image changed. Now it was a spreadsheet, the vendor payment logs for Greg Salter's security firm. "And this," I narrated, my voice unwavering, "is the conflict of interest trail. You approved invoices for IT security at 30% above market rate. Curiously, that same vendor paid for the consulting fees to a shell company registered in your name in the Caymans. We have the bank routing numbers, Ethan." Ethan looked at the screen, then at the stunned faces of the board members. His face went pale, draining of color, until he looked like a wax figure. The confident executive was gone. In his place was a cornered animal. He grabbed the microphone, the feedback squealing. "This is fake. She's hacking the system. She's unstable." He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You all know her. She's been jealous of me her whole life because she couldn't cut it. She's off her meds, Mom. Dad, tell them. She's having a breakdown." My parents scrambled up. My mother was hyperventilating, clutching her pearls. My father's face was purple with rage. He rushed toward me, not to check the evidence but to silence the source. "Laura," he shouted. "That is enough. Get out. You are ruining this family." "I am saving this company," I countered, not backing down an inch. "You don't have anything to do with this company." Ethan screamed, his voice cracking. "You're a charity case. I built this. I am the vice president. You can't come in here with your forged photoshops and think you can touch me." He looked at the security guards near the entrance. "Get her out of here, now." The guards hesitated. They looked at Ethan. Then they looked at the screen where a new document had appeared. It was a certificate of incorporation and a cap table. "You can't fire me, Ethan," I said, dropping the volume of my voice so that everyone had to lean in to hear the final blow. "Because I own the company." Ethan froze. The guests froze. My father stopped mid-stride, his mouth hanging open. "What?" my father whispered. "Aurora Global Logistics," I said, gesturing to the screen where the ownership structure of Obsidian Trust was now displayed, revealing my name, Laura McKenzie, as the sole beneficiary and majority voting shareholder. "I founded it 6 years ago with Marcus Thorne. I own 51% of the voting stock." "Ethan, you don't work for the board. You work for me." The realization hit the room like a physical wave. The investors began whispering frantically. The board members were pulling out their phones. Ethan stared at the screen, reading the undeniable legal reality of his own subordination. "No," he whispered. That's impossible. You're broke. You live in a studio apartment." "I live within my means," I said. "And I don't steal." I turned to the crowd, addressing the board members directly. "As of this moment, Ethan McKenzie is relieved of his duties pending an internal investigation. The evidence you see has already been forwarded to the SEC and the District Attorney's Office. This isn't just a firing, it's a criminal referral." My mother let out a sob, collapsing into her chair. It wasn't a sob of heartbreak for her son's morality, it was the sound of her social standing disintegrating. My father, ever the control freak, tried to salvage the wreckage. He stepped between me and the crowd, lowering his voice to a desperate growl. "Laura, stop this. Immediately. We can discuss this at home. This is family business. Do not do this to us. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in years. I saw the fear in his eyes. Not fear for me, but fear of the embarrassment. No, Dad, I said. This isn't family business. He rigged the wiring in a warehouse full of people. He stole from pension funds. This is people's lives' business. You ungrateful little bitch! The scream came from the stage. Ethan had snapped. The facade was completely gone. He didn't care about the investors or the wedding or the image anymore. He grabbed a heavy crystal vase from the head table and lunged off the stage, rushing toward me with wild, violent eyes. "I'll kill you!" he shrieked. "You ruined everything!" I didn't flinch. I didn't have to. Before he could get within 5 feet of me, 2 large men in dark suit security I had hired independently stationed by Maya for this exact moment intercepted him. They didn't handle him gently. One grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back, while the other secured his shoulder. The vase shattered on the dance floor, scattering shards of glass and water across the polished wood. "Get off me!" Ethan struggled, thrashing against them. "Do you know who I am? I'm the CEO, You're trespassing," I said calmly. "Remove him." The guards marched him toward the exit. The image was striking: the golden boy, the groom, the rising star, being dragged out of his own coronation, his tuxedo rumpled, shouting obscenities that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The guests watched in stunned silence. There was no applause. There was no music. Just the sound of Ethan's frantic, impotent screaming fading down the hallway, and the crunch of broken glass under the guards' boots. Then the doors slammed shut. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the debris of a destroyed legacy. My parents sat in the wreckage of their head table, looking small and gray. The investors looked at me with a new expression, not pity, not dismissal, but fear and respect. I stood alone in the center of the ballroom. My dress was still damp. My hair was likely a mess. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to hide. I felt the solid weight of the floor beneath my feet. The DJ, clearly panicking and on autopilot, accidentally hit a button. The upbeat intro to a top 40 hit blared for a split second before he frantically cut it off, leaving an awkward, ringing quiet in its wake. I looked around the room one last time. I didn't smile. There was no joy in this. It was a demolition necessary and messy. I turned my back on the head table and began to walk away. I didn't look triumphant. I just looked free. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the climax didn't crash. It crystallized. I didn't have the luxury of an emotional collapse. While the guests at the St. Regis were frantically texting their gossip circles and the waitstaff were sweeping up the shards of Ethan's rage, I was already in the back of a black SUV dialing into a conference bridge. The emergency board meeting I had triggered via the Obsidian Trust bylaws was convening in real time. My phone sat on the center console, the speakerphone broadcasting the panicked voices of men and women who had just realized their golden goose was a liability. "Ms. McKenzie." Arthur Sterling's voice was shaky, stripped of the condescension he'd shown earlier. We have reviewed the documents you uploaded to the secure server. The compliance waiver for Hawthorne. Is this authentic? The metadata is verified, Arthur. I said, watching the city lights blur past the window. The signature is digital and time-stamped. Ethan bypassed the safety protocols to trigger his performance bonus. If that facility had gone live next week and a fire started, the liability wouldn't just be financial. It would be criminal manslaughter. You would all be named in the suit. Silence on the line. I let the weight of it settle. I have already instructed outside counsel to freeze Ethan's corporate accounts and revoke his access credentials. I continued assuming the command I had paid for. Darius Holt is to be reinstated immediately as Chief Compliance Officer with direct reporting lines to the Audit Committee. No more burying reports. Agreed, another board member chimed in quickly. Motion to terminate Ethan McKenzie for cause effective immediately. Seconded, Sterling said. Done, I said. Release the statement to the press in the morning. We get ahead of this. We frame it as a self-correction, a return to core values. If we wait, we look complicit. I hung up. It was done. The empire Ethan thought he owned was now a fortress locked against him. But the war wasn't over. The battlefield just shifted from the boardroom to the family room. When I arrived back at my apartment building, a modest brick walk-up miles away from the penthouses, my parents preferred they were already there. My mother and father were standing by my front door, looking like refugees from a sunken luxury liner. My mother's mascara was running. My father's tuxedo was unbuttoned at the collar, his face a map of exhaustion and fury. I didn't want to let them in. I wanted to keep the door locked and let them scream at the wood. But I knew this conversation had to happen. I unlocked the door and let them into my small, tidy living room. "Are you happy?" my mother asked the moment the door clicked shut. She didn't sit. She stood in the center of the room, clutching her purse like a weapon. "You ruined his life, Laura. You ruined the wedding. Do you have any idea how much that cost? Do you have any idea who was in that room?" "I know exactly who was in that room," I said, tossing my keys on the counter. "Witnesses to a felony." "It was a mistake," my father roared, finding his voice. "He cut a corner. Everyone does it. You destroyed your brother over paperwork." "I stopped him from killing people, Dad," I snapped back, my voice finally rising. "The wiring at Hawthorne wasn't rated for the load. Do you know what happens when a distribution center catches fire with 300 people inside? I do. I know what it feels like to be crushed under a mistake someone else made to save money." My father flinched. He looked at my leg, then quickly looked away. He couldn't handle the physical evidence of their past failures, so he pivoted to the only currency he understood. "We can fix this," he said, his tone shifting from anger to a desperate, wheedling bargaining. "Laura, listen to me. You have power now. We see that. You own the shares. You can make this go away. Rehire him. Tell the board it was a misunderstanding. Issue a retraction." "You want me to lie," I said. "We want you to protect the family," my mother cried. "If this gets out, really gets out, we're finished. The club, the foundation, our friends, they'll drop us. Please, Laura, don't be cruel. We can be a family again. You can come to the house. We can start over." I looked at them, really looked at them. They were offering me love as a bribe. They were dangling the carrot of family that they had beaten me with for years, thinking I was still the desperate little girl who would do anything for a seat at their table. "You don't want a family," I said quietly. "You want a shield. You need me to be small so Ethan can be big. That's how it's always worked. I get hurt, Ethan gets the money. I get ignored, Ethan gets the praise. And now I get the blame, and you want Ethan to get the pardon." "That is not true," my mother sobbed, but her eyes were dry and hard. "It is true," I said, "and I'm done paying the bill." I walked to the door and opened it. "Get out. Laura, get out," I repeated. "And tell Ethan if he contacts me, I'll add harassment to the list of charges." They left trailing distinct scents of expensive perfume and bitterness. I locked the door and slid the deadbolt home. It sounded like a gunshot. I didn't sleep. Instead, I poured a glass of water and sat at my laptop. The personal fallout was messy, but the professional cleanup had to be surgical. I logged into the company directory. My first call was to Darius Holt. It was late past midnight, but he answered on the first ring. "Miss McKenzie." "It's Laura," I said. "You're safe, Darius. The board just voted. Ethan is out. You're reinstated effective immediately. And I want you to initiate a full safety audit of every facility we operate. Start with Hawthorne. If it's not up to code, shut it down. I don't care about the launch date." I heard him exhale a sound of pure, shuddering relief. "Thank you. I didn't think anyone was listening." "I was always listening," I said. "I just needed the hammer." I spent the next 3 hours drafting a plan for a restitution fund. The kickbacks Ethan had taken from the vendors were going to be clawed back, and I was directing every cent of it into a relief fund for employees who had been injured or terminated unfairly during his tenure. It wasn't a PR stunt. It was a values check. I wasn't going to run this company like a McKenzie. I was going to run it like a human being. But Ethan wasn't going to go quietly. I knew that. He was a narcissist who had just been publicly humiliated. He would burn the world down before he admitted he was holding the match. At 4:00 a.m., the alert started popping up on my phone. Ethan had gone to the press, or at least to the blogs that would print anything for clicks. A grainy photo of me from the wedding, looking disheveled and wet, was splashed across a Business Insider knockoff site. Headline: Hostile takeover at Aurora wedding. Unstable sister hijacks company from groom. The article was a masterpiece of fiction. It quoted anonymous family sources, claiming that I had a history of mental illness since my accident, that I was vindictive, that I had forged the documents in a fit of jealousy. It claimed I was suing the family because they cut me off. It painted Ethan as the victim of a deranged sibling vendetta. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Ethan. "You think you won. I'm going to sue you for defamation. I'm going to drag your medical records into court. I'm going to tell the world you're crazy. Fix this by noon or I release everything." He was trying to gaslight the public the way he had gaslighted me. He was betting that the noise of the scandal would drown out the facts of the fraud. I felt a flash of the old fear, the fear of being called crazy, the fear of being dismissed. But then I looked at the file on my desk. The audit trails, the bank statements. The truth wasn't fragile. It was just quiet. And I didn't need to be louder than him. I just needed to be clearer. I didn't reply to the text. Instead, I drafted a formal press release to go out on the Aurora Global Logistics letterhead at 8:00 a.m. It was short. It acknowledged the change in leadership. It stated that an independent investigation by a top-tier forensic accounting firm had begun, and it included a link to a public transparency dashboard where the safety audit results of the Hawthorne facility would be posted in real time. "You don't get to rewrite reality with volume, Ethan," I murmured to the screen. I was about to close the laptop when one final message came through. It wasn't from a lawyer or a board member or a hater. It was from Grandma Joe. Joe was the only McKenzie who had visited me in the hospital 6 years ago. She was the only one who sent birthday cards with cash I actually needed, not gift cards to stores I couldn't afford. She lived 3 states away, but news traveled fast. "Joe, I heard you finally stood up. Good. You broke the cycle, but listen to an old woman. Now that you've won, don't become them. Justice is keeping the scales even. Revenge is just tipping them the other way. Sleep well, kid." I stared at the screen. The anger that had fueled me for 6 years, the hot coal I had carried in my chest, suddenly felt heavy and cold. I realized she was right. The takedown was necessary. The humiliation of Ethan was inevitable. But if I kept twisting the knife, if I let myself enjoy his destruction too much, I would just be another Mackenzie using power to hurt family. I closed the laptop. The sun was coming up, turning the gray city sky a pale, bruised purple. Revenge had been the spark that got me out of the shadows. But revenge couldn't be the fuel that kept me running. That had to be something else. That had to be the work. I wasn't the villain in their story, and I wasn't the victim anymore. I was just the CEO. And I had a company to fix. The unraveling didn't happen with a bang. Real life isn't an action movie where the villain explodes. It's a procedural drama where they are slowly dismantled by paperwork, billable hours, and the grinding gears of the legal system. In the weeks following the wedding, the silence I had craved finally arrived, but it was the heavy, suffocating silence of a courtroom antechamber. Ethan wasn't arrested immediately. That's not how white-collar crime works. Instead, he was subjected to a forensic colonoscopy. The independent investigation I commissioned turned up everything. The Hawthorne waiver was just the tip of the iceberg. There were diverted funds, shell companies in Nevada and the Caymans, and a pattern of vendor intimidation that bordered on extortion. When the SEC finally stepped in, the charges weren't just for negligence. They were for securities fraud and embezzlement. He wasn't facing life in a supermax, but he was facing a decade of federal battles, bankruptcy, and a permanent ban from serving as an officer of a public company. His career, the one thing he had built his entire personality around, was dead. The fallout for my parents was less legal and more visceral. Their social currency, which they had hoarded like gold, turned out to be nothing more than confetti. The phone stopped ringing. The invitations to the spring galas got lost in the mail. The community they claimed to value so highly evaporated the moment the McKenzie name became synonymous with fraud rather than finance. They learned the hard way that their friends didn't love them. They loved their access. And without Ethan as the rising star, and with me as the vindictive daughter, they couldn't control, they had no access left to sell. A month after the wedding, I agreed to meet them. I chose a neutral location, a small coffee shop downtown, far from the country club district. I arrived early, bought my own coffee, and watched them walk in. They looked 10 years older. My father's posture, usually rigid with arrogance, was slumped. My mother wore a coat that looked expensive, but hadn't been dry cleaned recently. They sat down opposite me, looking small. "Laura," my mother started, her voice trembling. She reached across the table, but I kept my hands wrapped around my mug. "Thank you for coming. We miss you." "You miss the money," I said gently. There was no venom in it anymore, just observation. "That's not fair," my father grunted, though he couldn't meet my eyes. He's in a bad way, Laura. The legal fees are astronomical. They've frozen his assets. They're coming after our house because we co-signed some of his loans. We could lose everything." "I know," I said. "I read the filings." "We're family," my mother pleaded, the old manipulation surfacing like a reflex. "You have so much now. The company stock. It's rebounding. You could help us. Just a loan. To get the lawyers paid. To save the house. If we lose the house, where will we go?" I looked at them and felt a strange, hollow sadness. They were the architects of their own ruin, yet they still believed they were victims of a natural disaster. They still believed that family meant I was obligated to set myself on fire to keep them warm. "I can't do that," I said. "Won't," my father corrected bitterly. "You won't do it. You want to punish us." "No," I said. "I want to stop enabling you. If I pay Ethan's legal fees, I'm financing his delusion that he did nothing wrong. If I save your house, I'm validating the idea that status matters more than integrity. You sold my future to buy his present. I won't let you sell my present to buy his freedom." My mother began to weep softly into a napkin. "So that's it. You hate us." "I don't hate you," I said. "I just don't need you anymore. And I certainly don't owe you." I placed a business card on the table. It wasn't for a bank or a lawyer. It was for a family therapist specializing in narcissistic family systems. "I will pay for this," I said. "I will pay for as many sessions as you want, for all three of you. If you want to understand why this happened, if you want to actually repair the relationships, instead of just the reputation, I will fund that. That is the only money I will ever give you." My father stared at the card like it was an insult. "Therapy. We don't need therapy. We need liquidity." "Then we have nothing else to discuss," I said. I stood up. I didn't wait for them to leave. I didn't wait for the inevitable curse words or the tearful guilt trips. I simply walked out of the coffee shop into the cool autumn evening. I walked a few blocks, letting the city air fill my lungs. I found myself standing in front of the St. Regis, the venue where it had all ended and begun. The ballroom was dark tonight, but I could still see the ghost of the party through the glass doors. I could see the spot where I had stood in the wet dress, the spot where Ethan had screamed, the spot where the illusion had finally shattered. I pulled my phone out. There was a message from Grandma Jo. She hadn't asked for details, just sent a picture of her garden. It was peaceful, real. I looked back at the hotel. For years I had thought that revenge would feel like fire-hot, destructive, and exciting. But standing there on the other side of it, I realized revenge was just a mechanic. It was the pry bar I used to open the crate. What was inside the crate wasn't happiness, and it wasn't triumph. It was just the truth. And the truth is quiet. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need a microphone. It just sits there solid and unmovable, waiting for you to acknowledge it. My parents and Ethan were trapped in a prison of their own, making a prison built of lies and appearances. I had offered them a key, but I knew they wouldn't take it. They preferred the cell because the cell had mirrors. I turned my collar up against the wind. I didn't look back at the hotel. I didn't look back at the life I was supposed to have. I hailed a cab, gave the driver the address of the company headquarters, and settled into the seat. The wedding was over. The marriage between my family and their deceit was annulled. As the cab pulled away, merging into the stream of traffic, I thought about the last thing I had said to the empty ballroom that night. It was the only eulogy their legacy deserved. They wanted a drama-free wedding. They wanted a perfect, polished lie to show the world. So I gave them something worse. I gave them the truth. Laura finally found her peace not in the total destruction of her family, but in the quiet, undeniable truth she built for herself. It is a heavy price to pay for freedom, but sometimes it is the only currency that matters. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Let us know below, would you have offered them therapy or just walked away? We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.